Okay, Kat, you can take it away. Okay, hi everyone. Joining us today is Aileen Lee, founder and managing partner at Cowboy Ventures, a team that backs seed stage technology companies reimagining work and life through technology, or what they call Life 2.0. Aileen, if you want to introduce yourself a little bit.
Sure. Hi, I'm super psyched to be here, and I'm excited to hear from lots of people. I'm an MIT grad. I graduated a long time ago, and I was course 15, and I think maybe also 21. And so I have had a bunch of different jobs. I went to investment banking after MIT. I taught English in China. I went to business school. I worked for the Gap, and then I became a venture capitalist about 20 years ago. So I've been investing in tech startups and partnering with super early stage tech companies for the past 20 years.
Awesome. Yeah, just as a little bit of background, we have hackers from all around the world, even though our hackathon is put on by MIT students. So she said course 15 and 21, which is management, and I don't know what 21 is. I think it's like
it's humanities.
Yeah, okay. Embarrassing. Okay. Cool. I'll start off with a question really quick. What are some key features you look for when deciding which companies to invest in?
So we invest just in the US. So that kind of keeps it, obviously there's startups going on all around the world, but we invest in just the US. And we also invest in, I'm a seed stage investor. So basically that means usually the company is raising, like when I started doing seed 8 years ago, they're usually raising $1 million or $1.5 million. And it's usually like their first like big round or like, institutional investor round. Sometimes they raise a little bit of money from friends and family to do like a bootstrap prototype or something like that. So, and nowadays seed rounds are $2 million, $3 million, $4 million. So usually it's like your first round of investment where sometimes you need the money to build a product. Sometimes you need the money you've built a product and you need help on the go-to-market strategy. So the first thing is, what market are you focused on and how big is it potentially? It doesn't always have to be an existing addressable market. Like if you looked at Airbnb or Uber, for example, like they didn't really have markets, right? Or even Instacart or DoorDash, right? But you kind of think about how big it could be. And then we try and understand like what's the problem they're trying to solve and what's the solution they've come up with and how much better is it than alternatives in terms of like, is there a huge cost advantage? Is it more convenient? Do they make it a lot cheaper for the customer? Is it more delightful? How does it leverage data? And also for us, there's always some technology involved. So those are really the first things. And then obviously who's the team and like, how did they come up with the idea and what's their connection to the idea?
Yeah, wait, just a follow-up question on that. Like as an investor, do you usually look like what is like the most important thing you look for in terms of like, do you look at the team first and then that idea, or like a mix of both? I mean, like I imagine it would be a mix of both, but
yeah. It is a mix of both. Like some people will say market is more important than founder, and some people will say founder is more important than market. I don't have a hard and fast rule there. I mean, it's the founders can be awesome, but if they're going after a really small market, or if they're going after a market with a product that's not that differentiated, I think it's really hard to be successful no matter how great the founders are. So it's really, I think, both.
Okay. Awesome. So you talked really briefly about how your journey from MIT to like where you are now. Could you go more in depth on like what made you decide to go into venture capital?
So venture capital was kind of an accident for me. I had heard about it, not when I was in college, but when I was in investment banking at Morgan Stanley. And a lot of these analyst programs, they still may be this way. They were like a 2-year program where maybe some people will do a 3rd year and then some people go get other jobs and some people go to business school. And so when we were finishing up our 2nd year, a bunch of my colleagues, the other analysts, were looking for jobs, and a bunch of them were talking about venture capital jobs or private equity jobs. And so I kind of learned just hearing from them about what they were looking at. And at the time, the venture capital industry and the private equity industry sounded so interesting. Like you get to go look at companies, figure out either if you're going to buy them or invest in them, and kind of hear the founder story and look at their financials and think about the market. It seems so interesting. And then once you invest, helping them with growing the business or cutting costs or whatever you do, and then you get to do it across multiple companies. But the industry was pretty much all male. And like I'm a first generation immigrant. My parents are from China. Like we didn't really have any like hookup, you know, we didn't really know anybody who was in venture capital or even that many people in business. And a lot of the guys in my analyst class that were interviewing for venture jobs, they were all kind of like hooked up. Like they, you know, went to a liberal arts college. Their dad was a business person. They kind of grew up like playing golf and going to country clubs. And so that was kind of my impression of venture capital was like the people who kind of know how to work in those environments are the ones who get those jobs. And so I didn't apply. And then after business school and after when I was working at Gap, I was fortunate that this venture firm called Kleiner Perkins was looking to hire an associate, and they had never hired a woman before. And I think that the hiring person, John Doerr, who was my boss, he basically told the recruiter that he thought it'd be important for them to look at female and male candidates. And he really had them go try and find a bunch of female candidates, which is great. So that's kind of how I stumbled into this job.
Awesome. Yeah. So I guess that leads into one of the questions from the audience. Someone asked, do you have any suggestions for female identifying individuals trying to find their own place in tech or finance? Oh, I think you're muted.
Oh yeah, I'm muted, sorry. Well, I mean, that's a pretty vague question, right? Like if you're already in tech and if you're feeling uncomfortable, like you're in a job and I mean, I think it helps to find allies wherever you are in your group, whether it's male or female. But it can be really hard if you're working in a company that has very few women. And so if you can, you know, with your manager, having a conversation about like how it can be differently challenging being the only or the other, and seeing if you can get support either to hire new people or to really feel like you've got some allies that you can talk to about things that might be different and more challenging for you. But I mean, if you're in tech and you've got skills and you're in an environment you feel like is not supportive of women or someone who identifies as a woman, like you have lots of options. So you don't have to stay where you are if you don't feel like the people treat you fairly. There's like lots of you can email us at hello@cowboy.vc. We'll try and help you.
Awesome. Love to hear that. Yeah. Along those same lines, what are some steps you think that the finance industry can take to address gender inequality?
I think, again, I work with a nonprofit called All Raise that's trying to accelerate success for women in the tech ecosystem. And we focus on both trying to change the numbers and also trying to change culture, right? So, you know, one of our KPIs are around female founders and co-founders and whether they are able to be successful co-founding companies and raising money and scaling their companies. And then also on the investment side, whether we are successful at helping there be more women at every level, but especially the partner level, like the general partner level in venture capital firms. Those are the people who decide how much people get paid. They're the people who set the culture. They're the people who hire and fire and motivate and invest. And so I think that creates this potential vicious or virtuous cycle. If you have a monoculture at a firm, historically, which has been white men, a lot of women and minorities don't have a very positive experience pitching their companies to those firms. And also those firms don't have a very strong track record of actually successfully backing people who are different from them. And so I think we think that by changing who is sitting at the table and writing the checks in venture firms, we can positively impact the tech industry. But it takes culture change as well, right? Like it's not just hiring the people, it's also making sure that they have a shot at being successful. And so that's taking bias out of a lot of processes that exist everywhere, not just in tech.
Right. Yeah, I totally agree about like not just hiring like women and also minorities, but also making sure that they're in a position so that they can succeed and they have like the skill set and knowledge. So how would you, and I think that starts from like when they're young, right? In your education. So what's some advice you have for like hackers who are in college right now and perhaps
well, first, I hope that people who have hacking skills are going to do what they can to help make sure that we get lots of people to vote in the election. I think that like, I kind of wish that I had good hack skills so I could help like use them to get out the vote and to try and eliminate kind of false information that's going to negatively impact the election or people's ability to vote. But I think thinking about when you're talking about startup ideas, like who are you talking with? Do you have a tendency to just talk to people who are like you? We at Cowboy Ventures take a lot of pitch meetings from startups, and a lot of the time we'll get a pitch from 4 guys or 3 guys or 2 guys or 5 guys who lived together or worked together or roommates or friends of roommates, and they were always talking about startup ideas with each other. And so when we'll say, like, how did you guys meet? They'll be like, oh, we worked together, and then this guy's roommate was, and then we would have dinner and we would just talk about startup ideas. And so this is like the 4th thing that we've tried together. And I don't hear that. My hope is that in the future, when we get pitched by folks, that they're mixed gender and mixed ethnicity. I'd love to see teams that are just a bunch of different people from different backgrounds who are we became friends through work or from school, and we've been talking about startup ideas. So I do think thinking about being more inclusive, about reaching out to people who have a different gender, a different background, maybe not in your friend group, who seem smart and interesting, and pulling together teams of people from different backgrounds, I think all the data shows that you get to better outcomes, better financial outcomes, better decision-making. So go outside your comfort zone if you don't have a lot of friends from different backgrounds, and talk about startup ideas.
Yes, for sure. Yeah, and obviously that's a philosophy you've kind of brought to your own company. I guess from there, what key features do you look for when deciding which companies to invest in?
It's a combination, we started talking a little bit about, what is the market? Who are the founders? How did they come up with the idea? What's the product that they have built or are planning on building? What problem does it solve? And also kind of what they've figured out with very little resources, and also what they've learned. We like to look for what we call learning animals, because, there's generally not a playbook for startups. So it's kind of you have very limited information. How do you make decisions with limited information, or how do you get more information? And so trying to figure out how the people think and how they learn gives us a little bit of indication on how they're going to be able to kind of weave through the startup journey, because it's never just up and to the right. It's kind of hopefully it's going to be like a roller coaster, but hopefully it's like a roller coaster that goes up and to the right. But it all is about how you navigate and how you prioritize.
Mm-hmm.
And there's also how much you're trying to raise, and whether that seems reasonable, what you're going to do with the money.
Got you. Yeah, not every no startup is the same, right? Every journey looks different. But I guess one way to learn besides just doing it yourself and going hands-on with it is by reading books and seeing what's worked for other people. And we do have a question from someone that asked, what 5 books are you most likely to recommend to founders? And I guess adding on to that, just resources in general for people who are interested.
Yeah. I don't have a go-to list. I think Jim Collins has written some really great books about leadership and management. There's one called Good to Great that I'm a big fan of. Ben Horowitz wrote a book called The Hard Thing About Hard Things. I think it's quite a good book. I think today, given what's going on in the world, I think about I would read a book about race and racism. There's lots of books about startups and about founder journeys. There's you could read the Apple book or the Amazon book, but I also think there's so many great blogs that I would also, depending on what space you're going into, I would pay a lot of attention to the blogs and the news articles going on that are in the spaces that you're focused on.
Okay. We have another question from the audience, which kind of circles back to your own VC firm. So how did you get over your fear of failure when starting your own firm?
I don't know if I thought about it so much. I think if you think about it too much, you probably won't do it.
That's pretty fair. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, I don't think I thought about that much.
Okay. Were there any specific challenges that you faced when you tried to start your own VC firm?
Yeah, you have to raise money. So you don't have a VC firm if you don't have money. So I actually called, so we have a son who's now 10, but he was 4 at the time. No. How old was he when I started Cowboy? Yes, he was 2. Our daughters were 4 when we were having, we have twin girls, and we asked them to help name our son, and they decided to name him Cowboy Handsome Shiny Dolphin. So that was kind of like the pregnancy name that we thought was kind of like a project name that we didn't think was going to become real. And actually we wound up naming him Cowboy. And so when I was starting the fund, I decided to call the Cowboy Fund, because I kind of thought that was like the pregnancy name of the fund. I would come up with like a real name later. And because you don't have a business if you can't raise the money. So you have to you come up with your pitch and you try and meet investors. And I got no from a good number of people. And I have to admit that, I'm fortunate that I was pretty well pedigreed. I got to go to MIT and I went to Harvard, and I've been doing the venture job for 12 years. And so unlike a lot of other first-time managers, like I had a track record in the job. I was very referenceable. And a bunch of people said no to me. And I did wonder to myself, like, if I was a man, would they have said no to me? Maybe they would have been throwing money at me, and people were certainly not throwing money at me. But in a way like that those no's give you like a little bit of a chip on your shoulder to kind of like make everyone really sorry. So, and it shouldn't be easy. Like raising money for a venture firm or for a company shouldn't be easy, because it's not going to be easy running the firm or building the business. So it's kind of good to know if you've got the grit or the resilience to keep going.
Yeah. I actually had a really quick question about why you decided to go the VC route versus the startup route, because I've like heard some people say like, oh, successful VCs are usually founders first because they know like the ins and outs of the business.
So that is, I don't actually know if the data, I think that is like a legend, but I actually don't think that that's completely true. If you look at Mike Moritz at Sequoia, who's one of the most legendary investors, he was a journalist before becoming a VC. John Doerr, my boss at Kleiner, worked at Intel and Sun Microsystems, I think, but not like I think he had founded a company, but it wasn't a very successful company. So I think some of the best investors in history actually were not founders. I mean, today's venture environment, there are a lot more choices for venture capital than there were 20 years ago. And so founders now, I think, want to work with someone who can like empathize with their journey. And so when I was at Kleiner, I didn't have a ton of operating experience, as we call it. And I always felt like I needed more to be able to be on people's boards or to be able to really advise them. I looked young, I was a woman. I had never been like a CEO. So when the opportunity actually came up with one of our portfolio companies to be they wanted help. So I actually went in as CEO, and I was CEO for 2 years. And so that, like, when I went back to Kleiner, I did feel like I had lived through basically, things were going well. We raised a $20 million Series B, which at the time was like a really big one. Then the recession hit in 2008. We had to lay off half the company and kind of survive like the winter of startups. And then we were able to actually acquire 2 of our closest competitors. And then I was able to replace myself after 2 years. So I did feel like I had, gone through a lot of good times and bad times and lived through them. And that helped me to, I think, be able to relate more and coach CEOs more effectively.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. As a follow-up, do you think it's important that people that are trying to start their own VC firm also go through some sort of experience like that where they're leading a company?
I think it's helpful. I don't think it is critical. Like Mary Meeker, who's also one of the best venture capitalists out there, like she was a research analyst at Morgan Stanley, where she would she researched and wrote analyses on public stocks. I don't think it's required. I mean, at the end of the day, the best VCs generally have great judgment on risk taking, and they create a rapport with CEOs to be able to kind of partner with them for their journey. And I think different CEOs and different founders want different things. Like they don't want someone who can do their job for them. Like that's their job, right? They just want really great advice. And oftentimes they want perspective on what's ahead for them, someone who's kind of a chess player who can kind of coach them on how they see the chess match playing out, who can open doors, help them with hiring, help them with customer introductions, things like that. And you don't have to have been a CEO before to help with those things.
Okay, cool. I have a question from James Wang. He asked, what is your framework for asking founders questions? And how can founders apply that same framework in self-assessing progress?
Well, that's a good question. In pitch meetings, it's a lot about tell us where you've been. Like, how did you come up with the idea? What have you worked on? Like, since you started the company, what's worked, what hasn't worked? Where are you trying to head this? So, if we're super successful 3 years from now, what have we built and how do we get there? If we're not successful, what do you think could go wrong? And then in like one-on-ones that I have with CEOs that I work with, oftentimes it's about like, okay, what are your priorities right now? And what are you saying no to? What's keeping you up at night? Are there things that you feel like you are not addressing that you probably should be? Like, what are kind of the elephants in the room, or the things that are kind of like the big things that we might need to talk about? I think those are all hopefully useful things for us to think about personally, or like just in your everyday work context. But a lot is about like, what are you prioritizing and what you're saying no to, and whether your time and your calendar is aligned with those things.
Okay. Awesome. We have another audience question. What level of understanding of a business's finances do you expect in an initial pitch from a team of engineers? And do they need an MBA or business background?
I don't think so. I mean, now there's so much on the web that you can look up in terms of like, and also public companies, right? Like if you're building a SaaS company, you can look at the financials of existing SaaS companies and understand like, how do they recognize revenue? How do they think about what goes into cost of goods sold? How do they think about gross margin? How much of like your budget should you spend on marketing? Like you can kind of see the histories of a lot of companies that have been successful in different spaces. And so you can kind of figure out what should be in your profit and loss statement. And you can also look at financial models online for, seed stage companies. How do they think about, what to spend on? There's also obviously like so many resources, both at universities like MIT or accelerators or bloggers. So it's helpful to get someone who's been in finance if you've never done it before, to kind of like look at your spreadsheet and give you feedback on, but I don't think you have to have a finance person. I mean, one person on the founding team usually has to be like the CFO, who is going to be accountable for the model and the inputs and the assumptions in the model. But I think for seed stage, that's fine if one of the founders wants to be that person.
Okay. Yeah, all the terms you just threw out, I'm taking an accounting class right now and I'm struggling so hard. And that just brought back like so many.
Like nightmares?
Yeah.
Like what?
Like cost of goods sold. I'm like, right now we're learning like allowance for doubtful accounts or something, and like contra assets. And
that's that's definitely much more specific. Yeah. Like the good thing about tech investing is like if you're going into private equity, right, where you're going to buy a company for like $5 billion, right? Like there's a lot of details involved with like doing diligence on buying those assets and how you finance them, what can go wrong. And venture capital, like the math and the accounting is pretty simple, right? Because it's really, it is. It's really, you think about like, how are we going to make, what are we selling? How much is it per unit? How many of them are we going to sell per week or per month? And what goes into the cost to sell or deliver that service? And then kind of what goes into OpEx in terms of marketing or SG&A and things like that. It's pretty simple. And the good thing is, like with software, usually, like if you're getting into hardware, obviously, then you have inventory and you've got payment terms and things like that. But software historically has very high margins, which is also really nice.
Awesome. That's so good to hear. Because maybe now I was
Don't
thinking that now maybe I can be a VC. Cool. So I have another question. What strategies can people employ to make their startup teams more diverse?
I think, the first thing is recruiting. right? Which is when you have open positions, what are you as the CEO or the founders telling your team about like who's in the pipeline and measuring who's in the pipeline and the candidates. And many portfolio companies, I work with one company that was co-founded by 3 white guys. And when we got to 15 people at a board meeting, the founder said in one of the slides, like, we are now getting to be the company that none of us wants to work at, because we basically are a team of all guys and generally all white guys. And this is not the company we want to build. Like, this is an accident. Like, we're embarrassed that we got so far. And like, after the 3 of us, we basically hired 12 more people who are kind of like us because they're from our networks. He's like, we can't do this anymore. So basically the next 5 people we hire are going to be people outside of our networks, and they're going to be women and minorities. And we're going to have to work really hard to convince them this is a safe place to work, because when they look at the 15 people, they're going to be like, well, why didn't you think of this sooner? And so they asked for my help and the board's help to kind of have conversations with the women and minorities that we're interviewing to let them know that, like, we got you. Like, the founders understand that they got themselves to a place that is not feeling good for them. And they're going to try really hard to build a culture where all kinds of people feel really successful. And you can back channel with me or other people on the board if you feel like that's not happening. And so now the company, I think after that period of time, like for the next 10 hires, they were all women and minorities. So then we got to like about a third of the engineering team was women. And we were also tracking, but it was big, but you have to have the commitment at the highest level. It has to be the CEO telling the recruiters or the team, because you've got these, like, you need these people, right? You can't ship the product, or you've got customers who aren't happy. And like, it's so much easier to hire someone who was your roommate or like someone who you know and that you can vouch for. So you have to be willing to slow down your recruiting process and like work harder to go find people outside of your networks. And so we say you have to slow down to speed up. Like when you have to hire, you are not going to be able to make a lot of progress on things that you want to, but you have to slow down your process to make the right hires, and then you can speed up again.
Yeah, as a quick follow-up, so if anybody finds themselves working in an environment where they are uncomfortable with like how the hiring team is choosing to pick their employees, do you have any suggestions on how you can address the situation?
I guess, I mean, again, it's hard to know without being like having more details about the person's situation, but well, I guess figuring out if you have allies so that you can maybe go with your allies to talk to the hiring manager, or even like talk to the VP or the CEO about like trying to change the hiring processes, or if you see biases in the systems, like calling it out, but in a diplomatic way, and partnering with people to try and change the processes. And getting involved in bringing different people to the table or pointing out areas for improvement, either in the process or in the funnel. It's a lot of hands on the wheel. Like, there's no magic bullet to, I think, fixing the cultures or the practices. It's just like lots of little things.
Yeah, I know some people recommend not only having a mentor who can help you with like the technical side of like technical skills, but also having a sponsor who is usually like higher up and will vouch for you in when it comes to like promotions and stuff like that. But one of my questions is, how do you go about like approaching someone who's higher than you and like asking them, hey, can you like be my sponsor?
Yeah, I'm not good at that. So, but I think it's Sheryl Sandberg is really, I think she talks about this in Lean In, about how like she would often, women who she had never worked with before would be like, will you be my mentor? And like, that just doesn't really work. Like, a lot of people, and especially women and minorities, like they have a lot on their plates already. Like they have a lot on their shoulders, because unfortunately, a lot of people look to the minorities to solve the problems. And that's not really great, but it is what it is, unfortunately, in many cases. And so like, I can't tell you how many emails I get from men friends who are like, hey, will you mentor this woman because you're a woman? Like, I'm sorry, you can mentor her too. It doesn't have to be me. It's not fair to ask so I think actually like people that you work with, where you already have a relationship, you have contacts, they know your work, they know how you do, like that's the best way to develop that kind of a relationship, is to be working with someone and for them to see that you're great to work with and that you've added value, and then building that relationship over time, just saying, hey, like, is it okay if I ask you a question or feedback, or I'd love your support. I think that's the best way to do it.
Yeah. Awesome. Sounds good.
Awesome. Yeah. Sort of just circling back. So you kind of mentioned the team that you worked with that like hired all men and then had to like kind of fix their mistake. How do you learn from your mistakes and take accountability in the finance world?
Well, I mean, you learn from mistakes, and I've learned, like, I've been doing this job for so long. I've made every mistake in the book, and I continue to. I try to make new mistakes. I mean, I would say in the venture job, probably one of the biggest, not mistakes, but learning opportunities is when you pass on companies that wind up being really successful. And so you kind of think like, why didn't I invest in that company? And what can I learn from the bad decision that I made? Or when you invest in a company, it doesn't wind up working out. I mean, that is part of the job, is like, you know, nobody bats 1,000 in venture capital. If you're batting 500, you're very lucky. And it's also, I guess people will say it's more about slugging percentage than it is about batting average. I don't know if that means anything to you. My daughter's a softball player. So does that mean anything to you?
I don't know anything about
Yeah.
baseball
Okay.
or softball.
So batting average is like when you're at the plate, like how many times you actually hit the ball into play, right?
Okay.
Slugging percentage is like how far you hit it, like how many home runs do you hit, or how many triples, or how many doubles, like, you know, like hitting one home run every X at bats versus hitting singles every X at bats. Like home runs are more important than singles in venture capital. So like you'd rather invest in one snowflake than in 5 companies that get bought for $50 million, you know? So I have in venture capital, you have lots of opportunities to learn from those decisions.
Yeah, it sounds like there's like a story behind there when you said.
Claire, we lost you for a second.
Oh no, did I freeze?
No, you're back.
Oh no, am I back? Okay, cool. Yeah, I was just gonna say, it sounds like there's a story behind it. What you just said, like missing out on some companies that go on to be wildly successul. Oh
my God, so many.
Would you be able to tell us about like maybe one of those?
Sure. Like, I mean, I'm friends with these founders now, and they kind of give me crap for having passed. So hopefully, like, we try when we pass. Obviously, we know we're not right all the time, and that they're super successful, and that we regret our past. So, and we try and make sure the interaction is positive, and that they learn something from the interactions. That even if we don't wind up working together formally, we've created a good dialogue. So, I passed on Stitch Fix. I didn't. I met with Katrina a couple times, and she's a little bit of an introvert, and she was pretty quiet. Like when she was just starting, you know, like I didn't understand at the time that introverts and extroverts pitch differently. After I missed Stitch Fix and she's gone on to be so wildly successful, we've become friends. Like I now actually check myself when I'm meeting with someone for the first time, and I kind of either will ask them, or I'll think to myself, like, are they an introvert or are they an extrovert? Because if they're an introvert, I can ask questions in a different way, or I can spend extra time so I can really get to know how they think and kind of understand their power, even if they're not like wearing it on their sleeve. And some extroverts also, like, they're so good at selling, but then actually when you kind of like look under the hood, they're not as good at executing. So you kind of really have to, like my Stitch Fix example is like, you have to take the time to really understand what's under the hood. Because sometimes like the book cannot be judged by the cover. Many times.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
That's so cool.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh my God. I've passed on so many things that I shouldn't have passed on.
Sort of to build off that, what are some of the signs that you do look for in a founder or startup that indicate it might be like very successful?
There are certain people who you can kind of get a feeling that they're like forces of nature. And they're just like relationship animals, talent magnets, like they have this enthusiasm. And so the storytelling part is important because you need to be able to recruit people to your idea, right? Like the war for talent is incredibly intense, and big tech companies can pay people really high salaries, right? Startups that don't have a lot of money can't pay that kind of money. And so it really is like, who can you get to be on this mission with you to go through the ups and downs of startup life when they have a lot of other options? And so someone who has good self-awareness, so knows what they're good at and where they need to be complimented, who's good at kind of pitching their vision and their story, and that gives off this impression of both like, drive and humility, like authenticity and enthusiasm. Like it's kind of a good combination so that you feel like they're going to be able to recruit really high quality people. I think about Rachel Carlson, who's the founder of Guild Education. And we co-led her seed round. And Rachel and her co-founder, Brittany, had no tech experience. They had never worked at a tech company before, and they had no tech co-founder. And they were building a company in kind of the education space, which had been like historically a terrible investment category. Like very few successful ed tech companies have been built. And so it was kind of like uphill, but she's such a compelling founder. She is so strong at telling the story. She knows the market so well. She's got a personal commitment to it. And she just in her life has been like a lifelong learner. And so she kind of gave the impression like she's the kind of person that like you want to bet on because she's going to figure it out.
I see. Yeah. I mean, like, kind of going off of what Kat was saying, she mentioned wildly successful companies, right? And we were actually looking, we found out a while ago that you had coined the term a unicorn startup, and we like totally freaked out. Like, oh my God, we're interviewing the inventor of like, how is there a story behind that? Like how did you come up with that? How did it get like so widely adopted as a term?
So I had a new fund. I had Cowboy Ventures. I was about a year into the fund. It was a $40 million seed fund, and I had no investment. Like I'd basically not made that many investments. And so, it had the beauty of having some free time. I didn't have like a lot of commitments already. And so I was trying to do analysis on like the seed market. And if I had to make a list of the companies that have been the most successful in the past 10 years, that I wish, like if I had started Cowboy 10 years earlier, that I would have hoped to have invested in, what would the companies be and what would they have in common? So that if I could try and go, because there's startups everywhere, right? So what are you looking for? Are you looking for people who just graduated from MIT? Are you looking for people who dropped out of high school? Are you looking for people who are roommates? Are you looking for people who only worked at PayPal before? Like, what? And so I made this list of companies that had grown to be worth over $1 billion that were less than 10 years old. Either that were still private or had gone public, but had hit over $1 billion valuation. And then I just started making like basically columns in a big Excel spreadsheet of like, were they enterprise or consumer? When were they started? Who were the co-founders? Where did they go to school? How did they know each other before? What did they do before? Where did they work before? I even had like, what birth order were they? Like that one was like a lot harder to track down. But basically it wound up being the set of 39 companies. And I kind of pulled together some of my takeaways from what I learned. Like the vast majority had co-founders. There were like very few solo founders. The vast majority of the people were in their 30s and 40s when they started the companies, which at the time, when I did the analysis in 2013, like Mark Zuckerberg was like the hot startup founder of the time. And so everyone, like founders in their 40s would come pitch me kind of sheepishly being like, hey, I'm really sorry. I know I'm so old to be starting this company, but I kind of feel like maybe I could still make it work even though I'm so old. And I was like, you're not old, you're 40 years old. Like, don't feel embarrassed for being 35 and starting a company. Having tech experience is actually the background of the vast majority of the most successful unicorn founders. So I kind of like wrote up all these insights, and the phrase that I was using was public or private company that's less than 10 years old and is worth over $1 billion. And when you write that in a blog post over and over again, it's not very fun to read. And so I was like, I would highlight that phrase and I would substitute in like home run, monster hit, like, I don't know. And then like I substituted in unicorn, and it just made the whole thing like so much more fun to read. And it captured the feeling of like, it's kind of magical, it's special, it's kind of fun, it's very rare. And that it's not just some like lame business thing, it's like, there's more to it than just business
right.
success. And so that's kind of how Unicorn happened. And I published it and I called this like, Welcome to the Unicorn Club, learnings from like the 39 companies that fit this profile. And I was really surprised that like a lot of people read it. And then they didn't really start using the unicorn word maybe for like another 6 or 12 months, but then people started using it more and more. And I actually didn't get any credit for it. And then maybe 2 years later, Farhad Manjoo, who's a journalist at the New York Times, I didn't know him. He emailed me and he's like, hey, I work at the New York Times. I'm planning on writing a little blurb about how you coined this term unicorn and no one gives you credit for it. Is that cool with you? And I was like,
of course.
sure. And after that, that's when like, I think people started basically giving me a little bit of credit.
That's so funny. You were saying when you were like compiling all these characteristics of unicorn startups, you were looking at kind of like what makes them, you're trying to find some sort of pattern, I guess, to see like what makes them like so successful. Did you find anything, or what did you notice?
Yeah, if you look up, I think if you look up like Welcome to the Unicorn Club, TechCrunch, you'll see like the original post. I did one in 2015, and I think I did an update maybe in 2016 with like the new set and what were new learnings. But yeah, teams is number one. Like average age was another one. Experience working in a tech company was another one. At the time, enterprise companies were a lot more capital efficient and than the consumer companies. Like the consumer companies, to grow, they wound up raising a lot of money to acquire customers. I do think that like the venture market has changed a lot. So a lot of enterprise companies are not as capital efficient as they used to be. There were a bunch of, and also just like, it takes a long time. You know, YouTube is really an exception in terms of how fast, or, you know, WhatsApp, like from being founded to kind of exit, and also the size of the exit. Like most companies take 8, 10, 12 years to be able to become worth over $1 billion, or to get to what we call a liquidity event, like being bought or being acquired. And so I think at the time, a lot of founders were thinking like a startup was like a get rich quick scheme. And like, that's just not the case in most situations.
Yeah.
Oh, Claire's cutting out a little bit, but I think we have just enough time. Yep, you're back for one more question. This one has been upvoted the most on our Slido. So what skills should one have in trying to enter the VC space?
I think one is, I mean, the most important thing is probably venture judgment, right? And like, if you were handed 100 business plans or heard 100 pitches, the likelihood that you're going to actually be able to pick out the ones that are going to become successful is the most important thing. And so, you know, that's a combination of people judgment, tech trend judgment, financial analysis, competitive analysis, like product sense, insights into markets, a bunch of those things. So I think it's, you know, that's probably number one. And then number two is probably, you know, like, how are you going to see deals? You know, how are you going to get deal flow? And so like figuring out what's going to be your strategy for actually being able to see, like every year there's X number of companies are going to wind up being the most successful tech companies. And so how are you going to get access to them? Those are just two of the starter things. There's a lot of things. There's winning. So it's kind of, you have to see it, then you have to actually win it, win the opportunity to actually invest if it's a competitive opportunity. And then post, usually you want to be really helpful. The reason why you're going to win the opportunity to get in is because the founders think that you're going to be a helpful investor. And so, you know, how are you going to do that? And then you have to kind of rinse and repeat.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, hopefully this was a helpful talk for everyone who's looking to either enter the startup scene or VC scene as well. So yeah, thank you so much, Aileen. If you want to stay on for just like a little bit after like I close out, that'd be great. So we can like
thanks for having me.
bye.
And everyone have a great hackathon.
Yeah, bye.